We are honored to welcome Elly Fishman for her book, hold it up, Daniel, Refugee High, Coming of Age in America. This is a wonderful, wonderful educational narrative, work of journalistic reporting that was actually recommended to me by Chris, our tech coordinator, who is reading the book for a program and pushed for it hard and then pushed me for it hard. And little did he know that at home I have an education shelf where I read these year in the life of books and have been for 20 years. And what a great job you do with the book. Alex Kotlowitz, the author of There Are No Children Here An American Summer, says a wondrous tapestry of stories of young people looking for a home. With deep immersive reporting, Elly Fishman pulls off a triumph of empathy. Their tales and their schools speak to the best of who we are as a nation, and their struggles, their joys, and their journeys will stay with you. Elly Fishman worked as a senior editor and writer at Chicago Magazine. Her features have won numerous awards, including a City Regional Magazine Award for her first report on the students and faculty of Sullivan High School. And she has been teaching at the journalism department at UWM, though not this fall.
Not this fall. Not this
Welcome
fall,
to Boswell. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the lovely introduction. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming. I'm going to hold the mic closer. It's really wonderful to be here.
Would you, especially when we do virtual, it's interesting that you fall into a pattern of how you open an event. And so we would love for you to say a few words. And I do think you have a short passage picked out for you to read. Now, normally we'd have you at a podium. This is hard. We understand it. We're all with you. But thank you for trying.
I'll do my best.
I could hold it for you maybe, but
we'll try it. Okay. We'll see how it goes.
All right.
So would you like me to start with the reading? Okay.
Yes.
So yes, this is Refugee High, Coming of Age in America. And it, for those of you who haven't read it yet or encountered it yet, it follows a single school year at a high school on the north side of Chicago called Sullivan High School. And one of the main characters, and I say character, but of course she's a real person because this is a work of journalism, but her name is Sarah Quintens, and she is the chair of the ELL, or English Language Learner Department at Sullivan. And she has really special relationships with the students in the building. And she finds really unique and creative and idiosyncratic ways of lifting them up. And they also lift her up in moments of struggle and hardship. And I picked a passage that I thought was a nice illustration of that relationship, that symbiosis. So this comes a little over halfway in the book, and it tells a story about Sarah and her students. So I'm going to do my best to hold the mic and read the book. Luckily, it's a nice big type, so I think I can do it from my lap. Yes, so this is page 169, about halfway down the page. Over the years, Sarah has collected and mastered a set of facts about the ELL program, or International Academy. If asked, she can provide data points on the spot. 35 countries, 38 languages, and more than 300 students who have participated in ELL classes. Numbers like this can easily fit on a one-page document and hopefully compel attention. But Sarah keeps a second set of data in her head too, one less easily measured by standard metrics. It includes the time when Sarah left a laundry basket out and offered to wash students' uniforms. Many of them cannot afford to wash their clothes at the neighborhood laundromat. There is the period of time she found herself at the DMV almost once each week in order to help a group of Syrian students apply for driver's permits. And she needed to help them navigate Illinois' vetting process, which took longer for Syrian refugees than for others. And there are the hours she spent on her students. Pause 1 second. The hours she spent on her students' informal Americanization, such as teaching them to trick or treat for their first Halloweens, One year, she had her students organize themselves in a single file line outside her classroom door, and one by one, they approached Sarah and said, "Trick or treat," before Sarah handed them a piece of candy. Sarah has learned that seemingly simple things, like how to use an apartment doorbell, must be learned anew. She taught this particular lesson after she had heard students had been throwing rocks at their neighbors' windows. These important data points are hard to quantify. She can no longer keep count of the time she sat down with students to show them how to pay bills, or when, after discovering her students dating for the first time, she gives them impromptu sex education lessons. "Don't let your boyfriend make you feel bad for telling him to wear a condom," she'll tell the girls. "And if you're too embarrassed to openly discuss safe sex, then you're not ready to have sex." Because much of Sarah's goal for her students is to make them feel safe and happy, the numbers that ultimately matter are often the bad things that didn't happen and the ones beyond a tally. Also incalculable are the ways Sarah's students have left an indelible mark on her. Like when, a few days before Sarah's 37th birthday, her students organized a surprise party for her. Just before the class period was supposed to begin, Sarah was called to the music room at the opposite end of the hall. With Sarah out of the room, her students scurried to decorate. "Everyone put your food on the desks," a senior girl instructed. Soon the room was transformed into an international feast. Bowls of hummus, trays of chicken curry and peanut noodles, fufu, pico de gallo, and a spread of Middle Eastern salads topped a collection of desks pushed to the middle of the room. Several students brought liter bottles of Diet Coke, that's Sarah's favorite drink, and piled them in a corner. Another provided a store-bought cake with "Happy Birthday, Miss Q" written in frosting across the top. Once the food was out, the same senior told everyone to write "Happy Birthday" in their native languages on the whiteboard. 11 different languages filled the board. The group then huddled at the back of the room and dimmed the lights. They each held a corner of a hand-drawn banner that read, "Happy Birthday, Miss Q," in multicolored letters. When Sarah entered the room, the group cheered. The senior stage manager queued up a playlist of Sarah's favorite songs, including Justin Bieber's "Love Yourself," a tune she'd played for students dozens of times. Midway through the party, a group of girls handed Sarah a thick book made from construction paper and held together by string. Sarah grasped it carefully with both hands. The title, "Miss Q Travels the World." Each student had drawn Sarah a picture. They were images and descriptions of the students' home countries. She would drink jasmine tea, one page read, with an image of a small streetscape of home Syria. She would see giraffes and zebras, read another written by a Kenyan student who accompanied the words with pictures of the animals. The book brought Sarah to tears. Its pages were not just an imagined travelogue, but a document of what was lost to violence and war in the students' communities, a time capsule of their crumbled worlds.
Oh, what a wonderful passage. I mean, it is there's many wonderful passages. I don't want you to think you've got the best, but it is actually one of the best. It does. I have to say, you could send that to kids and they'd all want to be teachers afterwards. I mean, it's so.
Well, that's nice to hear.
Yeah, it's so. I was like, I should be doing that. But things don't always go as well at that as either. I'd love for you to start by talking about how you came to the story. It was from Chicago Magazine, where you're working, and like what led you to this?
So this project is many years in the making. I started in 2017, which is kind of hard to believe now. And I was still working at Chicago Magazine, where I worked for many years as a senior editor and as a writer. And it was shortly after Donald Trump was inaugurated, so January 2017. And one of the first executive orders he signed was a travel ban from 7 majority Muslim countries. And I went to a protest in Chicago, where I'm from. And it was at O'Hare International Airport. Probably many of you have flown out of there, a big, giant airport. And it was crowded with thousands of people holding signs that said, "No Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA," and ringing cowbells and singing together. And not only did I wonder, who are all these people who have gathered here at the airport, but I also really wanted to know who are the people arriving on the other side of the wall and what their lives would be like once they arrived in Chicago and found their communities. And as a journalist in Chicago, without even really realizing it, I'd always been drawn to stories of young people. And I just really like writing about young people. I love how They look at the world, how they forecast our future, how much hope they have, even if they carry hardship, which all of these kids do. And so when you think about young people, you think about schools. So I started to poke around wondering what school they landed at, and I was pretty quickly pointed towards Sullivan, which is in Rogers Park on the northeast side of Chicago, like, I don't know, 5 miles north maybe of Clark and Division, the book you read earlier, the book that's coming around later this fall. And I walked, I grew up in Chicago. I had reported out of many schools in Chicago, but when I walked into Sullivan, I had never stepped into a school like that. And I just thought immediately there's a story here and I want to figure out what it is. And if I, as someone who has written about education, is really in many ways engaged with education in Chicago, if I had no idea the school was here and what was happening inside these walls, probably a lot of people don't know what's happening here. And that's where the journey began.
Wow. I assume the whole book's not in the magazine. So
Right.
What were the things that you was the first thing that you focused on? Like what part of the story was in the original story?
So Sarah Quintens, who I just read about, is also one of the main focuses of the story. And she was still teaching in the classroom at the time. And I spent a lot of time in her classroom just trying to observe her students. I didn't want to impose myself or make them uncomfortable. So I actually spent a couple weeks just observing and letting kids ask me questions. In fact, she had all these games that she would have me play where I'd sit in the front of the room, not unlike this. She had at one point 35 kids in her class. It was a lot of kids to sit in front of, and they would ask me whatever questions they wanted. Before I started asking them questions, because I felt like that was an important dynamic to establish. So Sarah herself was a main focus. And as I started to get to know kids and get a sense of who was interested and open to the project, I identified 3 students who I followed over the course of about 2 months inside Sullivan. All 3 of whom I believe were seniors, so they're not in the book.
Oh.
But I spent a lot of time with them and learned through their experiences how complex and layered and multifaceted the resettlement process was. And, I think the article was like 5,000 words. And when I finished, I felt like there was still so much more story to tell and so much more to mine at Sullivan. And that was a great motivation to keep going.
One of the things about the book, I missed those kids. I'll have to go back and read the article to find out about the seniors, but you do pick some really great kids to follow. I mean, there's so much to their stories, and it's almost like each kid has a different aspect of the refugee process. Do you mind if I kind of throw out a kid's name, pronounce it incorrectly, apologize, and then you just say a few words about
Sure. Yeah.
One of the characters is Belange, who is from the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yeah, so they're all pseudonyms, by the way. So,
right. So I can pronounce it wrong.
You can pronounce it wrong, but I've pronounced it Belange.
Belange, thank you.
So yeah, Belange, when I meet him, is I hope I get all of these details correct. He's a sophomore. And like
We're
I
said,
and he has recently arrived in Chicago as part of a wave of Congolese refugees arriving in the city. And one of the interesting things about Belange and many of his friends and colleagues, if you can call it that, when they're high school kids, is the fact that they've actually never been to the Congo. They were all born in a refugee camp in Tanzania called Nyarugusu, which is kind of a city in and of itself. It's 150 or 200,000 refugees all living there. And Belange's father, Tobias, had arrived at Nyarugusu in 1996, and they left for the United States in 2016. So he had lived there for 20 years, and Belange himself and his siblings and many of his friends have actually still never been to the Congo.
Wow. They wind up in a bit of a community together. But that's actually one of the sadder stories in that, which is something I guess you as a journalist, one of the things about following, like when you decide to follow a community for certain, it's hard to backwards, like you don't know who's going to be successful, who's going to drop out, who's going to, so we won't say what happens because it's a spoiler, but they do have some problems with gangs.
Yes, we can call it like next week on Refugee High,
Yeah.
the teaser for reading the book.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess we could say that one of his friends early on in the book ends up getting shot. And so much of Belengue's story and the story of the Congolese community in the book follows the repercussions of how that takes hold and how that plays out in their community and in the neighborhood.
It's each, you really tried to look at kids from different parts of the world, and each community has their own issues. But one of the things you saw about several of the other community kids sort of flirt with gangs, but and maybe this was just coincidental and maybe this is an issue. Only the Black refugees really seem to be really courted by the gang, sort of in an of it or else. And so this become sort of, there's a race issue that seeps through the story that they have a harder time of it.
Yeah, that was certainly true in what I witnessed at Sullivan. I had heard at other high schools that actually, so a nearby high school that also has a decent size group, a good amount of refugee students and several Rohingya students, a lot of those boys were getting curious and involved in different gangs. But that was, a different school and a different story. So I was less familiar with that, although I saw some of that inside Sullivan kind of in a secondary or tertiary way. But yeah, I mean, when these African kids, these Congolese kids, and there are kids from several different African countries at Sullivan and speaking many different languages among them, arrive in a neighborhood like Rogers Park, and this is true for all the kids, they're living in a community that has a myriad set of problems like any community in a big city, and one of them is gang violence. And many of them are trying to negotiate what it means to be an African refugee and often coded as a Black American kid, or sort of how to negotiate that culture themselves and where do they fit and where do they feel they belong. And Belengue's story is certainly part of Belengue's story.
Well, let's move to the person we call Alejandro, who is from Guatemala. Now, he's also avoided gang violence in his home country, but he's a little older and seems to be more self-aware of how to avoid things, but he has his own issues. Would you talk a little about what he has to go through?
Yeah, so Alejandro, I decided to follow him for many different reasons, but he's actually an asylum seeker. And I wanted to highlight some of the differences that arise when you come to this country as an asylum seeker versus a refugee, which is really kind of the legal protections and the path towards citizenship or green cards or visas that you have as a refugee versus as an asylum seeker. So Alejandro fled on his own. He fled Guatemala City in 2013 because MS-13, the gang that has kind of taken hold of Guatemala City and many parts of South America, was targeting him and had already killed many of his friends. And he felt, and his mother in particular felt, if he didn't leave, he would be next. And they had a lot of reason to believe that, given the threats that were arriving at their door. So he comes alone and is reunited with his father, who he hasn't seen in about a decade when he gets here. So really, he's a stranger to his father. And because he grew up in a space where he was constantly negotiating how to avoid gang life, how to avoid violence, how to stay alive, that's how he moves through Chicago and is kind of always looking over his shoulder in a completely different way than Belengue, who arrives really unprepared for what he encounters in the city.
his relationship with, not giving anything away, but yes, his relationship with his father and his mother, who's left behind in Guatemala, is very poignant. I'm not giving anything away, but how to be yelled at because you made something with onions when your father doesn't like onions. That's a tough one.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. You realize these kids are coming here for safety and because they feel like they have no other choice. I mean, he leaves his family and his friends behind and comes here to completely start over and have to get to know his dad, who left him when he was very young. And it's not an easy choice for a kid to make. And I feel like that's an important thing to understand about all of these kids in many ways.
Yeah. One particularly intriguing character, human being who is a character in the book. It goes by in this book. Is it Mariah?
Yes, Mariah. Yeah. You got it.
She is from Iraq, I believe, from
Yes.
Basra.
Yeah.
And she finds herself continually sort of caught between worlds, I guess you would say. She seems to always be struggling with how to be an American, how to be a Muslim. Talk a little more about how you picked her up, and a little bit of her story.
Yeah. So Mariah was someone who I immediately noticed when I walked into the building. She's really spunky. She has a lot of opinions that she's not afraid to share, which I really liked. And she was so thoughtful in a way that surprised me in a 15-year-old girl about how to toe the line between her parents' more traditional expectations and the life she wanted to live as an American teenage girl in Chicago. And she's always kind of toggling between the two, as you noted. And I was really interested in that and interested in how that unfolded over the course of a school year, and also just how she thought about that, because that is, of course, something that so many, if not all of these kids are trying to negotiate as they acclimate to their life in America, particularly through school. And school really accelerates that for young people in a way that can often create a big gulf between kids and parents, because the parents are not having that experience of going to school and being immersed in a community. And I thought Mariah's experience and story was a way to unpack that and illustrate that.
Yeah, I mean, she's sometimes, at her first school, she stops wearing her hijab because she's one of the only Muslim kids there who, but then when she's in this school, she's sort of bullied by other Muslim girls, the Syrian girls who are.
Right. She wasn't wearing it the right way.
Yeah.
Wasn't the right style, or, her accent wasn't exactly right. She was alienated in some ways on both sides.
Yeah. I love the role that food plays in the book. It just seems to come up again and again. If this was not COVID, we would be serving something. I definitely, especially because I was watching the last season of Top Chef, and one of the contestants got kicked out for making bad fufu. Oh. And I was like, and there's a lot of fufu in this book. Yeah. And I was like, I need some fufu right now. But no, I'm sorry. Do you want to talk a little about the way that food bonds people in the book? And
yeah, this would have been very hard to report in COVID, because food plays such an important role in the book because, well, I would say for two reasons. One, it played such an important role in how I reported it. Breaking bread with people is an incredible way to build relationships and build trust. And I was constantly being fed incredible food, especially, and I was so moved by the generosity of these families. When I would go, I spent a lot of time in the school, but I also visited them in their homes. And whenever I arrived, there was a giant feast waiting for me. And I've said this before, but they would always say, "Oh, we thought your husband was coming," but it was like food for 25 people. So even if my husband was there, it was a feast. And, no matter how little these families had, they were so welcoming and so generous to me. And it was also a way for them to kind of share their culture and take agency in a time in their life where especially for these parents, I think for many of them, they feel like that's something they had lost. And so much is unfamiliar and so much is unknown, but in the kitchen, especially for the mothers, this was like their domain and somewhere where they had control and something they could share with me and we could share together. And those were really important moments. And also I just really like food. So those are when I would go back and look through my notebook, there are a lot of food notes.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, that was one of my favorite scenes, Sarah's birthday, but I just want to say, we're not even going to talk about Thanksgiving. That's an excellent chapter.
Thank you. Yeah. Refugee Thanksgiving is an annual event at Sullivan.
Terrific. It really also, okay, we're talking about little, but just because I thought it created the best, Thanksgiving is in some ways a problematic holiday now, but a lot of it isn't from the spirit. It's from things that we've imposed on Thanksgiving. And I thought that Sarah and the school really brought the true spirit of Thanksgiving back into the story. And I think that's also another chapter that a lot of people could read for inspiration.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, it is a really nice event and a way to kind of give the story to the kids and let them make it their own and bring their own cultures to the table through the lens of this American holiday. I
really love the way the teachers, notably Sarah, but also the folks she was working with, would take so many different kinds of, when you were talking about teaching students how to ring a doorbell or something like that, they also, whenever they were learning a lesson about the way something's done in America, they would do it by bringing their own cultures into it. Is that something that the school developed themselves, or is that common practice?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still visiting the school and I'm still in touch with teachers, and that's very much part of the ethos there. They want kids to bring their cultures with them and create this, they're the new Americans, right? So they're unique blends of where they're coming from and what they're encountering here in this country. And you see that in all of the classrooms and in all of the art on the walls and really at every corner of the school. And that's one of the really special things about Sullivan.
Even in the way, like, they're like, how would you wash your clothes? I really thought that was great. The other great unifier I thought in the story was music. The music scenes are just terrific. Would you talk a little about music and the kids? Yes.
So food and music, the great unifiers, specifically K-pop and Justin Bieber. But the kids, like food. One of the first most immediate natural ways to share your culture and to share a moment with someone is by playing your music and dancing together or singing along or just enjoying it in whatever ways, however that looks. And there's tons of music inside Sullivan. And one of the things Sarah did, and a lot of the other teachers, is at the top of a class would encourage kids to play their favorite song. And then she would play them one of theirs, 4 out of 5 of which were Justin Bieber song. But one of the things that I also really loved is that actually, like, music and movies is a way a lot of these kids learn English. They're so immersed in pop culture, and they call this the hidden curriculum at Sullivan. And I actually don't know if that's a Sullivan term or if that's a more official term, but it's kind of all the things you learn about American culture through stuff like music and movies. And so one kid, one of my favorite stories, which he only told me this after I finished the book. And I was like, oh man, why didn't you tell me this earlier? That happens all the time. Was his English was always amazing. And he would he's Congolese from Tanzania. And he would often help me translate in interviews with other kids. And he really made a concerted effort to learn English. His name is Felix in the book. And I asked him, like, how's your English so good? How did you do this? And he said he listened to one Justin Bieber song over and over again. And it was the song, "What Do You Mean?" And he's like, that's because that's the number one question I'm always asking people. What do you mean? Of course, if you know the song, it's like the meaning's a little bit different for Bieber, but I really loved that.
What was the name of the song that the kids, I mean, this cross-cultural thing was just amazing, that to me, the Tanzanian singer whose song was covered in Arabic?
Yeah, I think that's the pop star Yalin.
Yalin,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, so also the way that music makes its way through the world and takes on new shapes and forms is a really fun thing to trace too.
I love the way the kids started dancing in the circle from that, and the circle just got larger and larger. I felt like, was it a wedding or something? Would you talk on a slightly sadder note, talk about the, how the school has to deal with the PTSD in the students? And
yeah, so trauma is a huge part of life at Sullivan, and much of what they do there and much of what they do so well is think about trauma-informed teaching. And they really, like, I learned from them the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I would say everyone in the building who's working with these kids, that's how they think about education for these kids. So first, before you ask your kid or your students about the grammar of a sentence or a specific vocabulary word, you have the most important thing is to make sure they feel safe and they feel like they have community and they have food and they have shelter and that they have the mental health services that they need. And that's really what drives so much of the teaching and caretaking inside the building. And I've been thinking about this a lot because I think so many schools, whether there are big immigrant and refugee populations or whether or not, how schools can learn from this kind of model, especially as kids come back from 18 months away from school and re-enter the building with so many different experiences and all kinds of different traumas and hardships that they're carrying, and the teachers too. I mean, we're still in this crazy thing. And there's a lot to be learned from how these teachers approach their students and how they think about, the well-being of their students and how intertwined that is with, educational success.
Oh, by the way, I looked it up. I did write down the stuff about Yellen. That was the dancing, but it was Teja by Lava Lava.
Oh yeah, Lava Lava's huge.
Yeah. I was playing some of the videos of some of the people in the book before getting in the mood for things. So you'll want to do that too, because it's really fun. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was some of the side characters were also pretty interesting. I mean, certainly Chad, the principal, plays an important role in the book, and Josh and Rosita, and
he's the social worker who works specifically with the ELL kids, so immigrant and refugee kids.
Yeah, and then there another, and they all have interesting stories, and you really get to know their backstories as well and how they came to the program. One of the side characters who I like, sometimes, I say to an author, like, this person had a bigger role in this isn't a, like, you had to cut this person out because you can tell there's a lot of backstory in them. And I know it's nonfiction, but you seemed, and I really liked her too, is Lauren. Like, she doesn't belong in the book. Usually, like, doesn't belong in the book, but you keep writing about her anyway. Talk a little bit.
Yeah, well, there are very few American-born kids in the book, and there's a few reasons for that. I already felt like, oh, this is a lot of characters to ask a reader to follow over the course of a year. It's 4 students, it's several teachers, and I really did my best to make their narratives easy to follow, but it's a big, it's not a Russian novel, but there is like a glossary at the top, at the front of the book for a reason. So that's just a practical reason, but within the school, the kids are kind of split up for most of the day. So I didn't interact with that many American born kids because they were just in different parts of the building. They hang out. There's kind of, it's a really big.
You talk a lot
school.
about the cliques, from both the refugee cliques where they stay together, and then what the American born kids are sorted by, various other things.
Right. And they've got their own lives, and there's many great books that could be written about those kids too. But Lauren in particular was always in the library, which has kind of functioned as the unofficial ELL lounge. And I was so interested in why she chose to hang out with refugee kids rather than, so she's from Rogers Park. And rather than her American born classmates, because she certainly wasn't in the ELL program. And she was so wonderful with the kids. She was always in there tutoring. She was sharing music with them. She was, she actually gives like a short kind of keynote speech, sounds very formal, at Refugee Thanksgiving about why she loves Sullivan. And so much of that is because of her classmates from all over the globe. And I wanted to make sure that was celebrated too, because there are some amazing kids. It's not just the teachers who are looking out for these kids in the building. There are other high schoolers who are doing that too. And Lauren was one of them. And I also just I really like Lauren.
I love her.
Yeah.
So she can have her own book.
Yeah. The next book Refugee High Next Gen will be about Lauren.
Well, she just is actually, she can probably do anything, the Black Rocker chick. But she I was like, oh, she's going to come back to be the principal there someday.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
She's so cool. She's now a third year in college and studying film, and is going to do something amazing.
Yeah. She wants to work here. Just give her.
Okay. I'll tell her. Yeah. We text.
She's got a fan club. Would you like to, what's the fourth? I'm missing a kid.
Shaheena. I don't think we've talked about Shaheena.
Yeah, talk a little about Shaheena.
So Shaheena is from Myanmar. She's Burmese. She grew up in Yangon, the capital of Myanmar. And I don't introduce Shaheena until a little bit later in the book. But much of her story, not unlike Mariah, is about trying to negotiate a sort of independent life that she wants as a young person, which butts up against her mother's expectations. But in the case of her mother, that's an arranged marriage at age 15 or 16, which is a common, unfortunately, a common battle among particularly Rohingya girls and their families that unfolds inside Sullivan. And when you think about the myriad, I said myriad twice. I never said that word. I guess it's the word of the day.
The drop down.
Yeah, the many issues you think about in a public high school. Forced arranged marriage at age 15 is not one of them. And so part of telling that story is how a staff like the staff at Sullivan tries to figure out how to negotiate that and figure out what's best for the kid and best for the family, and what their role is and what lines they're kind of supposed to draw for their students and what lines they can't draw. So that's Shaheena. She's fiercely independent and following her journey as she figures out how to negotiate this difficult relationship with her mother and difficult situation was something that I found really interesting and wanted to explore.
Yeah. Is there somebody who had a side note that you wish you'd explored it more?
Of the four characters
No,
or
of anyone else?
Oh, well, yeah. I could have told this book a million different ways, chosen any different sets of kids, and I think it would be an equally compelling book. I met so many incredible students inside Sullivan, and the fact I followed these four because I built these relationships with them, and they had different experiences, and I wanted to have a set of kids that would represent, how diverse the resettlement experience can be for kids. But I absolutely could have chosen completely different kids, many of whom I met and spent time with and interviewed, and I think had Refugee High would still be I hope, compelling book.
Oh, absolutely. And some of them get little notes when Samir, who is so anxious to, he's how many times has he gone through school to try to graduate?
Samir is like, he's like a set of books. So Samir, he is a Syrian refugee who I had met actually when I was reporting the original story, but he didn't show back up at Sullivan until partway through the year. And I think that was like his third, fourth, fifth time trying to graduate. And there was a lot of reasons for that. He was too old to be in high school. He had finished high school in Syria. I think he had even potentially started college, but his family fled without any of his papers, and without there was really nothing the school could do except for try and graduate him. And they gave him chance after chance after chance.
But he's working at the same time.
But he's also working to support his family. He works like 2 or 3 different jobs, and it's really hard. It's really hard to go back to school and to be in classes with kids who are 6, 7 years younger than you, and feel like you're ready to start adulthood, and you're back at a small school desk having to do a bell ringer at the top of the day.
Well, I don't think I can talk too much more about the book because I'll give everything away.
Yeah.
But it is what wonderful stories.
Thank
and
you.
So inspiring. What were some of the inspirations for writing the book? Did you have any?
Yeah, I read a lot. I read so much nonfiction, and then I was like, okay, I can only read novels now. I need to take a break. But I mean, there's such an amazing tradition of narrative nonfiction, even in Chicago. So of course, someone like Alex Kolowitz, I love his writing. Also, Stud Sterkel, a great tradition of also just elevating the everyday lives of people in the city, and as a way to understand our cities and our communities better. I also read Catherine Boo, Beyond the Beautiful Forevers. I read Evicted, Milwaukee shout out. I loved that book. I read it many times. I read Random Family by Adrienne LeBlanc. I could keep going. There was a stack. There was a large stack.
Well,
of
I have a
books.
book for you to read.
Okay, I'm ready.
When I was talking about community books, the one that's coming out on September 7th, it's called Karachi Vice. It's by a woman named Samira Shackle. And it follows 5 people over 5 years in Karachi, a city of 20 million people. And it also reminded me of the Catherine Boo. And there's a crime reporter, an advocate for women's rights, and like a community map maker who's a advocate for the poor, an ambulance driver, and a rural housewife. And the story, like, she just brings Karachi to life and all the complications. And we just see it as other, we say, well, everyone's Muslim there. Maybe we now understand Shia and Sufi, but like they're all, because of the partition, because of the War of Independence in Bangladesh, and because of famine, because of Taliban, all these different groups of people have settled in the same city. And so the book is about how they have to navigate the territory between different ethnic groups that are controlled by organized crime and politics, and then the Taliban as well for parts.
Oh, that sounds good.
A little recommendation there for you. She's doing something with us eventually. That's the nice thing about virtual stuff. It's like, even if you had lived in Alaska, I could have said,
yeah,
I love this book, and I would have. I would have come to you and said,
Thank you.
we're doing it.
Well, and I like it because, it's a book about a school in Chicago, but I feel like Sullivan is a prism for so many stories unfolding in so many places. And, there's a lot, of course, local connections, but it's a book that can be appreciated by people living in any city with immigrants and refugees and any community trying to figure out, it's how to welcome newcomers.
One, you might have noticed that the event was co-sponsored by the Home Program at Linden Sculpture Garden, which is a wonderful refugee-driven cultural program of arts and music and poetry and food. And I was talking to Kim, the coordinator, and she was talking about their work at South Division High School, which is really our Sullivan, I guess. I think that's true.
Yeah. I think so.
I hope you'll be able to do something somehow with them eventually.
Yeah, I've met the principal there and I really like him. Jose Trejo, I think is his name. I hope I'm getting that right.
It's an alias. No,
it's an alias, yeah. And he seems like he's doing really amazing stuff at South Division. Yeah.
I think it's time for us to ask some questions from the audience, or Chris has a question from our home audience.
Okay.
I'll repeat the question.
Sure.
Joanne in our Zoom audience wants to know how accepting were the Sullivan students, American Sullivan students, of the refugees, and what did the school do to prepare them for the refugees?
Okay, so from Joanne, how accepting were the American-born students of refugees, and how did the school prepare them as the school because the school was not focused on refugees when the principal got there. So how did they help them adapt?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, there have always been refugee and immigrant students at Sullivan. That's definitely baked into the school's history. And when Chad Adams stepped in as principal in 2013, he decided to really put serving and educating refugee and immigrant kids at the center of the school's mission. It was always part of the work that they were doing. And it was always a diverse school, although it certainly has changed since 2013. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, the kids for much of the day are kind of operating in parallel. So a lot of the American-born kids are on the south wing of the school, whereas the ELL students, they travel through the school in groups and clusters. So they move from class to class together, and they're often they're divided by language ability. So they're in totally separate classes from the American-born kids, except for a few, which are music and art and gym, and then sports teams. But the kids are, one of the things that's so amazing is they come from such different backgrounds and such different places, but they're all teenagers, and there's so much shared experience too. They're looking at the same shoes online, and they're watching the same viral YouTube videos, and there's a lot of shared experience too. And I really loved seeing that between the kids, and especially as the refugee kids are at Sullivan longer, they start to integrate more with the American kids. And like a couple of Lauren's best friends, one was a senior from Myanmar, and another was, I think, a junior girl from the Congo. And so it's really cool to see. I mean, you really get to see that shared teenage experience across cultures, across languages, across borders inside Sullivan.
Do you have any questions from the audience? I'll repeat. Questioning about Shaheena and getting married in the United States at 15. Isn't there a law against that?
Yes, but these are religious marriages, so they're not legal, official, documented marriages. So when the school calls Department of Child and Family Services, for example, and they come to investigate, the family can just deny it. And that's often what happens.
Yes, Sherry? What's been the kids' reaction to the book? Yes, Sherry.
So it's interesting. I really did my best to walk them through what was going to be in the book and what this was going to feel like. But, you know, it's strange to encounter your story on the page. And I think for many, it's very empowering. And for some, it's been hard to see. And, you know, that's always the case when you're writing about other people. And it's something I try and be super thoughtful about, especially with young people. And so when that's come up, I've just tried to keep the lines of communication open and encourage them to reach out to me and we can have conversations about it. But for the most part, they seem really excited about it and proud to have been part of it. And one of the cool things is, you know, they're like, I want to tell the story so other kids can feel less alone and other kids can learn from my experience. And that's like a really beautiful thing for me to hear and to be able to help them do and share.
So the question is there bullying at the school and how do they deal with it administratively?
I'm sure there is bullying. I mean, it's a high school, but I don't think I encountered very much of it. I mean, the kids seem so respectful of each other. And honestly, if they're bullying each other, it might be in a language that I don't understand. So it might just be totally over my head.
Well, the Mean Girls were kind of bullying.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And Mean Girl, you know, there's Mean Girls in every language and every culture.
Yeah,
so
one of the, yes, the universal language of meanness.
Yeah. So
and
that's true.
And also, and I would say, you know, the Belange, you know, that was sort of like he was being, because sort of in that story, not the gang, but he is sort of being bullied a little, isn't he?
Yeah. So, yeah. In that case, right. That is happening. It's mostly happening outside the walls of the school when he's walking home and he's being targeted by some American kids. But I didn't see it as much inside the building. But certainly, you know, like teenagers bully each other. Definitely, it's just part of that time of life. And I mean, humans bully each other. So it's certainly happening. And like what Mariah experienced, feeling bullied about how she was wearing her hijab is part of that. So I guess the answer is yes, there is bullying. But in many ways, it looks like a lot of teenage bullying, but through, you know, the lens of a variety of cultures.
Question?
There is anthropology technique.
So gentleman said that your book's title parallels coming of age in Samoa for Margaret Mead. Were you, though you are a journalist, were you also taking an anthropologist side of background in that?
Well, actually, that is a coincidence, the parallel, but I did enter college really interested in being an anthropology major and was always drawn to ethnography, but I found the language completely impossible to parse and had found that to be a really frustrating hindrance in the field in general. And so in some ways, seeking out journalism was a way of doing that kind of work, but in a way that I felt like communicated these stories to a wider audience outside the institution. And definitely, you know, what I'm interested in is finding stories that I feel like need to be heard or haven't been heard enough, and using the platform that I have, which I'm really grateful to have, to help do that. And I wrote this book in a way that young people can read it. I really want young people to read it. I want it to be read in classrooms. I want it to be read by teachers. And I can't say that very many anthropological texts that I've encountered read that way. So that, you know, that's without realizing it, that there's definitely a relationship between my interest in anthropology and the work that I do, but with, you know, in some ways sort of rejecting how anthropology maintain like the audience it seeks, and how it's so targeted towards anthropologists and people reading that kind of work, whereas this is something I really want everybody to be able to read. Although I did really love the book Euphoria about Margaret
I was
Mead.
just thinking about that. Yeah.
If you haven't read it, it's really good. It is a novel, though.
Lily King, she's a star. We have time for one more question, I think. Oh, and that might be from Chris.
Melissa asked, obviously, in the news lately, there's been a lot of news about refugees. Is there a way we can support these kids if they're not a teacher or connected to them?
So the question is, it's funny, we were talking about how one of the questions I had asked was, how are things going? Because in the book, they're losing funding, they're worrying about not having enough students, and you said, oh, let's change it quickly. So with the Afghan refugees coming to the United States, is there something we can do, not as teachers, but to help support these kids?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, you know, I wrote this book during the Trump presidency, where almost very, very few refugees were coming into the country. And then now in the last 2 weeks, has it been? Suddenly that's changing. And I'm still in touch with folks from refugee resettlement agencies, and they are on the phone every day preparing for Afghan refugees to arrive. It's going to start happening within a week or two in our communities, and they're staffing up, and they're finding people who speak Dara and Farsi, and they're preparing for these kids to arrive. And there's kids and families. There's so many ways to support these refugee resettlement groups that are here in Milwaukee, that are in whatever city you're in. I mean, places like Home are great ways to do that.
We've done some events with Lutheran Social Services.
Lutheran Social Services is another one. I mean, they come here, and there are so many needs, from furniture to clothing to just having someone show them how to like navigate a city that sits on a grid, which I don't know if Milwaukee does, but Chicago does.
It's a broken grid.
A broken grid. Or, you know, where do you find an address on the building? You know, all these things that we just take for granted, having grown up here or lived here for however long. There are all these places where you can volunteer your time, or offer to help fund some of these families who come in the most cases in total poverty, to help them start to acclimate and to kind of rebuild here in the US.
Well, with that said, we will be, because we actually close a little earlier, so we're staying open a little later for folks to get their books signed. But I wanted to thank you for so much for this book, and reminder, folks, that we do have books for sale. We have more coming tomorrow, because this is our first kind of event where we had to reorder books, and it turns out that warehouses don't have enough staff to send books out, so they didn't get here in time. But you'll come back to sign them, so our books will be signed. You can also do personalization requests. Thank you to Home and the Linden Sculpture Garden. Chris will be setting up a table here for you to sign. Thank you all for coming, and thank you and the computer for coming. We wouldn't have a bookstore, virtual or otherwise, without you.
Thank
Thank
you
you all.
so much.